So my son said he was interested in the story of my background with role-playing games. I mean, we've been around this topic a few times. Like, I wrote a vampire novel called The Tepish Agenda, which is essentially, how do I put this? It's my backstory to the character that I created for Vampire the Masquerade, and there's a couple of different versions of him, and most of the book has to do with characters I met and played with in the chat on the White Wolf website. White Wolf is a publishing company for Vampire the Masquerade. And my son likes that book, and he's bugged me to write. He hasn't bugged me. He's implored me. No, it's not words, man. He would like me to write more, and there's 2 more books in that series because there's another version of the character as he was created to play tabletop. And then there's a 3rd book, well, if I ever write them. So that's in there, but the little précis I gave of my role-playing career was enough for Alex to say, hey, I like that story, can you tell me more? And so I decided, yeah, sure, let's go ahead and do that, because those are fun for me to do. The beginning of my role-playing career is definitely Dungeons & Dragons. But the timeline on it is a little questionable. So I'm going to put together a whole bunch of different things that I know are true, and the reader can connect them, or the viewer can connect them and infer. I did not have the original mail-in pamphlet for D&D. My first experience with D&D that I remember was in 2nd grade. And somebody else already had the blue and red kit. There was like a player's guide and a dungeon master's guide, and one of them was red, the other one was blue. It was like the first actual mass market iteration of Dungeons & Dragons. I didn't have it initially. It was another kid. I don't remember which kid, but I was interested in it, so I'm sure at that point my mom bought me a copy of it. She always supported anything that revolved around reading. She really pushed reading. So before I talk about my first character, I know that my origin in Dungeons & Dragons is heavily tied to Lord of the Rings. I don't know if I'd read it by that point, because it's a rough set of books to get through. It's hard for me to have enough patience now to read again. It's heavily wordy, so I don't think, even though my mother was pushing reading, and I was reading by the age of 2, I don't think my mom had made me read The Lord of the Rings by the age of 7, or I would have hated it. On the other hand, there's an animated version of Lord of the Rings by Ralph Bakshi that came out in late 1978. I would have been 7, and I would have been familiar with that in some way because my mom was into Lord of the Rings. I think there's an animated Hobbit before that, and I think I had experience with the Hobbit before I had experience with Lord of the Rings. Now, that Ralph Bakshi animated Lord of the Rings doesn't cover the whole story. If you've ever seen it, I forget where exactly it cuts off. I want to say it does all of Fellowship, but I don't remember where exactly it stops. I know it's not, I think it's not just Fellowship. But anyway, so I would have heard of the character of Sauron, but know nothing about it. The Rankin Bass animated Return of the King doesn't come out until 1980, and I was playing D&D before then. But I know there's a gap in the plot because the Rankin Bass Return of the King only covers Return of the King, and Lord of the Rings covers more than Fellowship, but leaves you with a gap as to how Frodo and Sam get captured and wind up where they are at the beginning of Return of the King. So I know it covers part of Two Towers. So I didn't know anything about who Sauron was other than that he was ultimately evil. So essentially, when I started playing D&D, I wrote a backstory for Sauron. So my first D&D character was Sauron, except he was chaotic good. And the story I wrote, I was fascinated by the Mirror of Opposition, as I still am. There are a few magic items in D&D that I think are fascinating to play with. I think the Deck of Many Things is a fascinating thing. I've always been enamored with the Bag of Holding and the Mirror of Opposition, which sets up that classic you versus you trope, used so effectively in Avengers Endgame. No spoilers. So my rationale was, and remember I'm 7, if you owned a Mirror of Opposition, you could Mirror of Opposition yourself, creating an evil version of you. So then my character imprisoned the evil version of himself so that he could make copies of himself off of the copy. And it isn't multiplicity. There's no... I mean, maybe there's a structure in the rules to prevent you from... I don't know. I'm sure this radically violates the rules in some way, but I was 7, and it made sense to me at the time. So I made an evil Sauron, put him in prison, and then when I was worried about my own mortality, I would make a new me, and I didn't consider things like the consciousness or what you'd remember or any of that. All I knew was there would still be a good Sauron alive. So I did that. I don't remember if it ever came into play. And eventually the evil Sauron escaped. So in my backstory, he escaped to Mordor, holed up there, and became the evil villain of the Lord of the Rings trilogy and the Hobbit, etc., etc. So that was my beginnings with Dungeons and Dragons. 2nd grade. I know I owned many of the advanced Dungeons and Dragons books. I had the Player's Handbook, had the Dungeon Master's Guide, had the Fiend Folio, had the first edition of Deities and Demigods, which includes Melnibonian mythos, which is the Elric series, and the Cthulian mythos, which is my first experience with that, the H.P. Lovecraft stuff. Eventually, and this is in my 30s, post-divorce, I think, maybe even later, I sold all of those. I sold them on eBay when I had a fairly active presence on eBay, and I sold them to a buyer in Germany for a couple $100. So I shipped them all internationally on his dime and got rid of my D&D books. But yeah, that was where we began. Dungeons and Dragons elementary school, not really knowing what you're doing. Basic D&D into advanced D&D. And so that's the origin story. That's also about the same time, I guess I should add these details, about the same time my parents got divorced. They were divorced when I was 7, which is the same time that I created my first D&D character. So my mother was taking us to a whole lot of movies, because I understand better what it's like to be a single parent, to be responsible for 2 kids, having to feed them and entertain them while working full-time, going to school, trying to keep your sanity. So, also during this period, and I know this is a little bit later, my mother took us to see Superman 2 in the movie theaters, and it was almost a nightly occurrence, because my mother had a crush on Steven? was going to say Stephen King. That's not right. My mother had a crush on Christopher Reeve, so she'd take us to get dinner, and then we'd go see the movie. So I've seen Superman 2 over 100 times, most of which were in the theater, which is probably... No, I'm not going to say that's the beginning of my relationship with superheroes, too, because my first superhero was Spider-Man, and it was also second grade. It was a student marketplace where you could get fake money for your behavior in class, and then you could bring stuff from home. At the student marketplace, you could exchange your fake money for the goods that people had brought from home. Well, it was third grade. This one was third grade. And my first issue of Spider-Man was somewhere in the hundreds. And it was a mafia war between Silvermane and Hammerhead. I believe it was for the control of the Maggia, which I've always mispronounced until the recent video game. And I believe Dr. Octopus was involved somewhere. I know Silvermane and Hammerhead were. So yeah, that was my first issue of Spider-Man. Didn't know anything about it. It was something to read that had color and pictures to it, which I wasn't used to. And so I know I bought that comic, and that's where my relationship with superheroes started. So yeah, my parents were divorced when I was 7. I was living in Washington. I may even try and drive past that elementary school now that I think about it. Interesting. Didn't role play a whole lot for a few years. It gets picked back up in junior high school, by which time I was living in Bakersfield. So, that's the origin story. The comics thing was a nice little, oh, by the way. But that's where we're going to leave that, and next will be junior high and the beginning of high school. Cool. Peace.